My grandson was treated like a suspect on his way home from school. Is that your idea of safety?
Respect is not a privilege you hand out after humiliation.
We are following procedure.
Then your procedure is broken, and justice will demand an answer.
The room fell into a silence so sharp it seemed to slice through the fluorescent hum above their heads. Every pair of eyes shifted between Angela and the captain, caught in the weight of words that refused to be dismissed. It was more than an argument. It was a crack in the armor of power, a moment when truth stood uninvited but undeniable at the center of the room. The question now was whether the system would bend or whether the people would have to break it open themselves. If this moment stirs something in you, leave a comment with one word: justice. And remember to like and follow so the story and the fight for truth can continue. The late autumn breeze off the lake carried a thin chill through Lincoln Park as Angela Robinson eased her aging sedan along the tree-lined street. On the passenger seat lay a trifold flyer from a Southside community center, its headline promising a town hall about fair streets and equal treatment. She had tucked it there that morning as a reminder, a small seed of intention waiting for evening. Angela had planned nothing dramatic for this errand. She wanted to stop by an old town bookstore before heading home, maybe warm her hands around a latte. Chicago was loud and ordinary around her. Runners pacing past, a dog tugging at a leash, the click of bicycle gears, the distant chant of fans arguing about the Cubs. She had picked up that latte 5 minutes earlier at a busy Starbucks a few blocks south. She greeted the barista with a simple "good afternoon" and left $1 in the clear tip jar, as she always did. The cup, still warm, sat in the center console, steaming faintly, its paper sleeve softening from the heat. Angela drove the way she approached most things, calmly, carefully, and with a quiet attention other people rarely noticed. The sedan's heater whispered over her shoes. The radio murmured a talk show about the first frost likely to arrive by Halloween, perhaps earlier this year. Flashing lights cut through the street ahead. Portable signs and orange cones funneled traffic into a narrow lane. A temporary checkpoint was in place, ringed with blue and red strobes. Other cars idled, blinkers ticking like slow metronomes. Angela signaled and rolled to a stop, already lowering her window. The evening smelled of rain and wet leaves. The sky sagged the color of pewter. An officer in a navy jacket approached with a flashlight angled down. He had the compact, restless posture of a man who disliked being still. "License and registration, ma'am," he said in an even voice. Angela offered both, along with the insurance card. "Of course," she said. Her tone stayed neutral. She held his gaze and waited. He glanced at the license, then at her face, then at the address line. "Southside," he read aloud, as if testing how it sounded in the open air. "Purpose of travel in Lincoln Park?" "I have a stop at the bookstore in Old Town," she answered. "Then I head home." The officer's flashlight slid across her dashboard and came to rest on the cup in the console. The light moved again, slower, annoyed by nothing in particular. Another figure stepped up, captained by insignia, taller, broader, with a deliberate way of placing his feet. He did not smile. "Evening," the captain said. "Step out of the vehicle for an enhanced check." Angela felt the smallest lift of breath in her chest and let it fall away. "Captain," she replied, "may I ask the basis for the enhanced measure?" "My documents are valid." "This is routine," the captain said. "Step out now." Routine. It was a word meant to flatten all sense of context. Angela unlocked the door and slipped from the driver's seat with slow, visible movements. The air was colder out here. She stood beside the car, palms resting lightly on the roof, heels together. Behind the checkpoint, a couple in a hatchback watched with wary curiosity, their windows barely cracked. A cyclist dismounted and checked his phone, then put it away when a third officer waved him along. The first officer his nameplate read, O'Connor held her license again. "Address confirms Southside residence," he said, not quite to himself. His breath made thin clouds. "We'll need a more thorough inspection." "好的，妹酱. I understand traffic safety," Angela said softly, "and I'm cooperating. I'd also like the inspection to follow policy." She kept her tone practical, not combative. This was a public street with other eyes around, but eyes did not always translate into truth later. She had learned that long ago. The Captain Stevens, according to the stitched panel over his chest, tilted his head as if listening for a sound she had failed to make. You can wait by the hood, he said. Well be a minute. Nase. A minute stretched. Rain began as a mist, settling on her coat. The bookstore would close before long. Angela let her eyes travel slowly, taking in the temporary floodlights, the exact angle of the truck parked crosswise at the curb, the portable camera on a tripod whose lens pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. She could hear the radio chatter from a patrol car, clipped phrases, an address repeated, a request for verification that did not sound urgent enough to be about her. She kept breathing. She remembered the flyer on the passenger seat, the meeting that week at the church on Cottage Grove, where parents planned to share stories that always sounded too similar. She thought of one story she had heard the previous month. A pediatric nurse from Brownsville turned away at a checkpoint 3 times in 1 week on her way to an overnight shift. The mug of coffee she never finished because she was late to triage again. The head nurses measured polite email about attendance, how slowly dignity eroded in those small frictions, never spectacular enough for a headline. Stephen stepped closer, the toe of his boot near the edge of a manhole cover. We can make this quick if you cooperate, he said. I am cooperating, Angela said. Her voice remained level. I would appreciate clarity on the specific concern. O'Connor returned from the patrol car, holding her license and the clipboard. He did not hand the license back. There's been some irregularities with Southside vehicles after dark, he said. Nothing personal. Of course, Angela said. She looked at his hands, the way he held the clipboard, the slight bounce of his knee. She looked past him to the line of cars now thinning as other drivers were waved through. The pattern was familiar. Some were random, others were necessary, and yet the necessary ones looked alike. At the curb, a woman in a compact sedan raised her phone to chest height and seemed to consider recording. An officer stepped into her line of sight and gestured for her to keep moving. She did. Angela's breath fogged once, then cleared. The latte in the console had stopped steaming. She thought about the Old Town clerk who would set a copy of a poetry collection behind the counter for a woman who might not arrive in time. She wondered if she would still make it. She wondered whether it mattered. Ma'am, Stephen said, impatience now an edge in the air. We don't need a lecture. We need compliance. I'm not offering a lecture, Angela said, and let a small, almost apologetic smile touch her mouth, just requesting clarity. Another minute slipped past. The rain thickened, peppering the windshield with a polite, steady drum. The checkpoint lights kept flashing, a repeating announcement with no words. The captain turned to speak with O'Connor in low tones. Angela stood where she was. She shifted her weight to ease pressure on one heel and then stilled again. Voices carried oddly in damp air. She heard South Side again, as if geography were an offense in itself. The radio in the patrol car crackled, and someone farther back barked the command for space, for order, for the cars to keep moving. A jogger passed, slowed, then continued when he saw the cones. Somewhere a siren rose and faded. Angela traced the edges of her calm and found them intact. Ma'am, O'Connor said, returning once more and not looking at her directly. We're going to continue with an enhanced check. Stand by the hood. He set the clipboard on the roof, its metal clip glinting under the lights. She nodded. I'll stand right here. In that moment, she slid a hand along the cuff of her coat as if to brush away a dot of rain. The gesture was ordinary, the kind any person might make in any weather. Her fingers found the smooth face of the watch at her wrist sleek, black, unremarkable to anyone glancing once. The glass was cool. She had learned, over years, no one here would guess that some actions must be visible and others must be invisible. The visible actions were courtesy and patience. The invisible was simply preparation. She would not narrate her dignity. She would hold it. O'Connor shifted again. Stevens watched the road rather than her face, as if a different threat might appear from somewhere else. A cyclist, the same one from earlier, had found a route around the cones and was now pushing his bike along the sidewalk. The dog from before barked once, high and startled, at a horn. Angela kept her eyes on the sleek hood of her car, the way the checkpoint lights painted it in alternating washes of blue and red. She had loved colors as a girl, the pink box from a teacher who told her to keep the lid closed between usings. And now, the only pallet available was the one assigned by authority. She wondered whether the bookstore owner would recognize her if she arrived late. She wondered, and then she let the wondering go. A pickup rolled through the lane. Its driver waved forward with barely a glance. He lifted a hand in thanks. Another sedan, then a compact SUV, both guided around her car with practiced efficiency. A young couple in a rideshare whispered to each other and then looked away when they realized she had noticed. Stevens cleared his throat. "We're about done here," he said. The words dull and tiresome, their shape already known. Angela exhaled once, slow enough to feel it. She did not look at him. She adjusted the lay of her sleeve by 1/2 inch. She shifted her fingers on the watch face, an absent-minded movement that would mean nothing to anyone else. She could feel the rhythm of her own pulse under the band slow, even reliable as a metronome. She thought of the flyer again, and of the church basement where coffee would be served in styrofoam cups after the meeting. People would bring pie and cornbread and stories that had taken a lifetime to gather. They would sit with their coats draped over their knees and try to place the week into a pattern that might someday be called progress. She had promised herself to listen more than she spoke. Listening was a kind of power everyone could hold. Rain ticked harder. A city bus hissed to a stop at the corner and then pulled away, shining a wash of light across the wet street. O'Connor checked the clipboard, pressed his lips together, and then glanced at Stevens for a cue. Angela remained where she was, still figure beside a car, still a woman under an ordinary sky. She tucked a straight curl behind one ear. The paper sleeve on the latte had softened into a gentle mush. The captain finally turned back to her and seemed ready to say something official. She lifted her chin a fraction, prepared to answer, prepared to ask again for clarity if needed, prepared to move as the next minute required. She did not hurry. Haste belonged to someone else. Angela lightly touched the face of her smartwatch, as if absent-mindedly. A tiny signal light blinked once and went dark. The tiny light on Angela's smartwatch had flashed once back at the curb, then vanished into the matte black face as if it had never lived there at all. She carried that quiet pulse with her through the glass doors of the Lincoln Park station, where the air smelled of bleach and old coffee and rain-off coats hung on the metal rack. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead. A vending machine blinked stubbornly in the corner, offering potato chips and candy bars behind acrylic. Down the hallway, a pair of officers talked about whether the Cubs could string together a late-season run. Their voices rose and fell like a game on the radio, easy and unaware. At the processing counter, the clerk slid a plastic tray forward. The tray was scratched and cloudy from years of keys and coins and the occasional wedding ring someone wished not to surrender. Angela placed her possessions inside with unhurried care. A wallet, a house key, the receipt from the bookstore she might not reach tonight. She kept her breathing steady. She had learned long ago that breath is the steadiest metronome a person can own. Officer Ryan O'Connor hovered at her shoulder, his clipboard tucked tight against his ribs as if it might wander away on its own. He read from her license again, low enough to pretend it was for the form, loud enough to be heard by the room. Southside address, he said, the vowels flattened. He tapped his pen on the board. You know the drill. Angela did not sigh. She counted the patient 3 beats and answered, I would like to make a phone call. Her voice was even full of breath, the kind of tone an English teacher might praise for clarity. After the check, O'Connor said, and flipped the page as if pages made rules. Captain Mark Stevens appeared from a side office with the brisk gravity of a man who expected the world to tilt when he entered a room. The cheap blinds behind him rattled an inch and settled. He studied Angela for the space of a heartbeat, then turned to O'Connor. Move it along, he said, eyes already on the next problem he planned to invent. Captain, Angela said, meeting his gaze. May I have clarity on the basis for continued detention, given that my documents are valid and I complied at the scene? Stevens smiled without warmth. You've had a long evening, he said. We'll have you on your way as soon as we make sure everything is in order. The phrase in order was one he used the way some people use please. A filler, a hinge, a way to end, a conversation he never intended to begin. He gestured toward a line of tape on the floor and told Angela to stand there, then drifted toward the observation glass that looked into a small interview room. The glass reflected the room behind it as a faint ghost. Desks, a bulletin board with flyers about trunk or treat events and early flu shots, a poster reminding employees to wash hands for at least 20 seconds. Next to the poster, a memo about duty scheduling had been pinned and repinned so often the paper had grown soft at the corners. Through the glass, a man in an immaculate navy suit paused, adjusted his tie to a fraction more symmetry, and turned slightly so the light found his face just right. Councilman Richard Hayes carried himself with professional ease, the sheen of a person seasoned by press conferences and ribbon cutting. The jade green of his pocket square stood out like a leaf in late autumn. He spoke to Stevens in the light, casual tone of someone dictating a holiday card. "Good evening, Captain," he said. "We need less friction and more results." "The program depends on numbers." "Understood," Stevens answered, and his eyes flicked once, not at Angela, but toward her tray and the clipped license on the clipboard that refused to be returned. Angela took in the exchange. Not the words alone, but the rhythm, the short sentences that skirted meaning, the confidence that comes from believing the room exists to agree with you. She felt the faintest ache at the base of her thumb, where the watch band pressed into skin. She looked past the man to the bulletin board again, where the church on Cottage Grove had posted a flyer for a community supper the following weekend. "Bring a dish to share. Tell someone's story." A hand-lettered line at the bottom read, in a different pen, "Bring your neighbor if they need a ride." "Ma'am," O'Connor said suddenly, as if he had caught her wandering mind like a paper airplane in an office. "Place both hands on the counter." She complied. The counter was cool laminate, a little sticky from a spill wiped in a hurry. The clerk keyed in lines of data without expression, the soft clack of keys like white rain. A man with thoughtful eyes and a suit that fit as if selected by someone who cared stepped out from the hallway. Detective Anthony Carter held a file folder like it had weight that wanted acknowledgement. He nodded once at the clerk, once at O'Connor, and then his gaze moved to Angela's license on the clipboard. He reached for the board with the absent courtesy of a doctor removing a thermometer, said, "Excuse me," and sighted along the card's surface. Not a quick glance, but the workmanlike inspection of someone who trusts his eyes. "Captain," he said, without raising his voice, "it will be proper to verify this identification through federal channels." Stevens didn't look up. "We'll handle it in-house," he said. "This isn't complicated." Carter did not argue. He shifted his attention to Angela. "Ma'am," he asked, his tone careful, "are you requesting counsel?" Angela measured his face and found there a familiarity she had seen before in good classrooms, good clinics, good rooms where someone had decided their job was not to win a contest, but to hold a standard. "Yes," she said, "I am invoking my right to counsel and asking to make a call." She spoke the words as if placing them on a shelf where others could not knock them over. Stevens's mouth tightened. "Detective, this is a routine delay," he said. "Stop complicating it." Carter looked at the license again, then at Angela's watch band, where an unobtrusive seam in the strap would have been invisible to anyone not trained to notice. He said nothing about the watch. Instead, he let the license catch the light from the overhead fixture, and the faint pattern in the plastic woke like a map seen from a plane at night. He closed the folder without removing anything from it and set it next to the clipboard as if weighing the board down with a small paper anchor. Inside the observation room, Hayes leaned forward to speak through the open door frame with the smoothness of someone practicing candor. "No one wants trouble," he said to the air, "as much as to any person. If the process runs smoothly, the public rests easier. This is about keeping neighborhoods in balance." With down the salt of farts, Angela had lived long enough to know what balance meant when the word came from a suit. Balance often meant some people remained still so others could always arrive on time. The rain knocked faintly at the windows. A custodian passed with a yellow rolling bucket, the mop handle steady in his hand. He slowed to ease the bucket around a traffic cone someone had brought inside when the storm began. He nodded to Angela, the small nod of one human to another, in a room designed to make everyone flatten. "Ma'am," the clerk said, returning a small portion of his attention to her from the rectangle of the screen. There's a delay on the system. You'll need to wait. Thank you, Angela said. It was always worth saying thank you, even into air that did not know where to put it. Carter, still standing near the counter, studied the edge of her license one more time and then placed it deliberately in front of Stevens. Captain, he said quietly, I served before the detective shield. The physical features on this card are not the kind a casual print shop reproduces. I recommend verification. Stevens let his gaze land on Carter at last, a measured glance that said more about territory than about facts. Detective Carter, he answered, I recommend you return to your assigned casework. Hayes looked up from the observation room and offered a small smile that was not meant for Angela at all. It was the private smile of a man reassuring a partner the bridge would hold. Captain, Angela said, not to plead, not to push, but to occupy the space her voice deserved. I am again requesting to make a phone call. You'll get your call at the appropriate time, Stevens said. And when would that be? She asked. With care under your policy? After we're done, he said. The end of his sentence dropped like a lid onto a box. O'Connor shifted from one foot to the other and looked briefly at the TV mounted high in the corner. The muted screen showed highlights from a rain-delayed game, a runner stealing second, as if the base had been promised to someone else and he had decided to borrow it for a minute. Captain, Carter said again, but softer, the way someone knocks once more on a door they know is locked, not to be let in, but to mark that they tried. He opened his folder, lifted a thin flashlight no bigger than a finger, and shone it across the face of the license with a careful hand. A pattern rose and vanished like breath on glass. He switched the light off and pocketed it. Sir, it's better to be precise than fast. The wall phone rang. Its bell was old-fashioned enough to have a real ring, not a chirp, the kind of sound that used to pull a person from a couch on a Sunday afternoon. The clerk startled, then answered, cradling the receiver against one shoulder as his fingers returned to the keyboard. This is Lincoln Park, he said. His gaze sharpened. He straightened, and the hand holding the receiver grew still. Yes, he said. Yes, she is. He glanced at Angela without meaning to. Repeat that? His voice softened. Understood. He set the receiver down with care, as if it were very warm. The fluorescent tubes hummed. The vending machine blinked. The rain found its rhythm. Who was that? Stevens asked. Boredom practiced like a hobby. The Pentagon, the clerk said. He did not dress the word importance. He let it be as plain as possible in the room, as if it could take care of itself. Silence walked across the tile in soft shoes. In the hallway, the conversation about the Cubs pitched itself down to nothing. Hayes' reflection held still in the observation glass. A portrait suddenly unframed. O'Connor cleared his throat, but found no sentence to attach to the sound. The custodian stopped the mop bucket without a splash. Angela did not move. She collected the quietness and set it behind her eyes, a place to return to later. Stevens exhaled through his nose. What did they want? He asked. The question shaped like derision, as if wanting were a tacky thing for a federal office to do. The clerk looked at his notes, though there were no notes. They asked if Angela Robinson was here. Carter blinked once, the kind of blink a careful person allows when a piece of a puzzle turns and fits. He looked at the watchman again, not with surprise, but with the calm of recognition. A television down the hall, on a different channel now, displayed the Capitol at dusk. The dome lit like a lantern. A scrolling caption spoke of committee calendars and budget considerations. No one cared about those words in this room. Stevens' shoulders lifted, then settled, then lifted again. A small tie trapped under a dress shirt. He set the license on the counter. He did not touch it. Behind the glass, Hayes adjusted his tie, but the move failed to deliver its usual comfort. The pocket square looked too green by half, as if it had not been invited and came anyway. Carter stepped closer to Angela, his voice pitched low so it would not scrape. Ma'am, he said, carrying the word with respect, not habit. For your comfort and safety, I am recommending immediate removal of restraints. Stevens did not answer. The rain marked time. Somewhere to the left, the vending machine decided to accept $1. A spiral turned and surrendered a candy bar to a tray with a soft thud. Hayes looked through the observation glass. His political smile stalled. Carter said softly, Please remove the cuffs. Everyone turned towards Stevens. Tires whispered on wet concrete outside the station as engines idled, and the sound rolled down the hall like a slow drumbeat. The rain had settled into a fine veil that floated under the streetlights and drifted through the open awning above the side entrance. Angela felt the air change before anyone spoke a charged stillness, as if the building had taken one quiet breath and held it. She carried the memory of the wall phone ringing in the previous hour and the clerk saying the word Pentagon with a care that had landed softly and stayed where it fell. The tiny light on her watch no longer showed, but the knowledge of what it had set in motion walked with her like a companion who did not need to be introduced. The lobby doors opened on their hinges without hurry, and a small procession crossed the threshold. Men and women in dark suits with discreet badges moved with calm purpose. A tall officer in service dress followed. Colonel Michael Turner, his presence unforced, his gaze steady. He did not fill the room with volume. He filled it with measure. Moisture clung to the shoulders of his coat, and he brushed one sleeve once with the back of his hand as if to clear space for the work he intended to do. He greeted no one with flourish. "Good evening," he said, and the words found their level. He glanced once at Angela in a way that registered a person rather than a problem, then turned toward the counter where her license still lay. The clerk slid it toward him with the kind of respect a person gives to a document after a phone call changes its weight. Detective Anthony Carter stepped in beside Turner and spoke low, not to perform but to inform. "Sir, I recommend verification of physical features under a dedicated light. I checked with a pen light." The response looked consistent. Turner nodded, took a small UV wand from an aide, and passed it over the card in a smooth arc. In the cool glow, microtext and a buried seal woke like constellations in the prepared sky, then dimmed as the light moved on. He did not comment immediately. He set the wand on the counter, aligned the card with the edge, and said, "Identification authentic." Captain Mark Stevens, who had arranged his face into a posture meant to convey patience, let the posture slide by a single degree. He stood flanked by Officer Ryan O'Connor, whose clipboard had become a shield with nothing to guard. Councilman Richard Hayes hovered by the door of the observation room, a practiced smile poised in neutral, the pocket square in his jacket a little too green for the weather. Turner introduced two members of his team with minimal words and pointed them toward the corridor that led to the records room. "Begin a capture of live system states," he said. "Request the server map. Document chain of custody on every machine you touch." They nodded and moved, wheeling in a small cart with a portable console and a sealed equipment case. One of them asked the clerk for an outlet, then produced a power strip of their own without waiting for the answer. Angela watched the choreography with the detached attention of a woman who has spent a life inside schedules she had rarely needed to announce. She let the rhythm of it run through her. The economy with which Turner's team handled cables, the way Carter stood near enough to help and far enough to avoid turning help into a statement, the careful courtesy of the custodian who moved his mop bucket against the wall to clear a path without being asked. She breathed, and the breath kept time with the weather. Hayes stepped forward, then with the easy cadence of a man accustomed to microphones. "Colonel," he said, bright and cooperative, "it seems we've had a small misunderstanding. Our captain is as committed to community safety as anyone in this city. We depend on his calm judgment during the busiest hours." He let the words hang as if they might arrange themselves into a bridge everyone could cross without getting their shoes wet. Turner did not shift his weight. "Councilman," he said, offering only the title. "For now, we need administrative access and a quiet room. However, we can make anything available," Hayes replied smoothly. "Lincoln Park is proud to cooperate with our partners. Let us keep residents at ease." "K-May, residents are at ease when their rights are not conditional," Turner said, and the sentence was not sharp so much as precise. He turned to the clerk. "Please provide a list of all active accounts with right access." Stevens cleared his throat. "Colonel, this is a local station. We have protocols." "As do we," Turner answered. "We will observe both sets." Angela heard her name, then spoken by Carter as he approached with a small box of tissues and a paper cup of water. He placed both on the counter with the ordinary kindness of a person who refuses to make a person into a case. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if you need a moment." "I'm all right," Angela replied. Her voice warmed the air between them by half a degree. She kept her palms resting lightly on the counter's edge, as if holding the furniture might help the furniture hold the room together. A tech from Turner's team called out a request for Ethernet access, and the clerk pointed to a panel behind the counter. The tech thanked him and asked permission before pulling a small screwdriver from a pouch on the cart. The screwdriver had a cloth wrap at the handle to keep it from slipping in damp hands. It seemed to Angela that these people had learned to be courteous even to tools. O'Connor, who looked younger under fluorescent light than he had on the street, shifted closer to Stevens. "Sir," he whispered. The word did not go anywhere. Hayes tried one more angle, turning his body toward Angela as if to invite her into a narrative she had not requested. "Ma'am," he said, "we are sorry for any inconvenience you've experienced tonight. The city will, of course, review the checkpoint's procedures. We have community safety to consider across our diverse neighborhoods." Angela met that smile with a measured stillness. "Safety arrives," she said gently, "when enforcement is even-handed. If a map shows stops clustering around one part of town, the map is speaking. The last half year has been speaking." Carter exhaled, not relief exactly, but recognition. He removed a slim USB drive from his jacket pocket, set it on the counter, and indicated its small label with a fingertip. "Internal memos," he said, with no theatrical weight. "Scheduling notes, patterns of deployment. I have made duplicates." He did not look at Stevens as he spoke. He looked at Turner, then at Angela, then at the clerk who would log the receipt. Turner's eyes flicked to the drive, then to Carter. "Thank you, Detective," he said, affording the title the exact respect it deserved. He lifted the drive with thumb and forefinger like a tiny parcel and passed it to the tech at the console. "Ingest and cross-reference with roster changes," he instructed. "Mark any directives that specify geography without supporting incident reports." The tech nodded and slid the drive into a protected port, then began to type. A screen filled with lines of text and timestamps. Across the room, the vending machine glowed as if it were also attending the briefing. Stevens tried to stiffen again into the shape of authority, but the edges of that shape now looked drawn in a lighter pencil. "We have nothing to hide," he said. "This is a media spectacle, born from a minor roadside delay." "We are not the media," Turner said mildly. "We are the part of the government that counts what happened and preserves it." Hayes set his smile at a new angle. "Colonel," he said, "I share your dedication to clear process. We've all had long nights. Perhaps we could put a pin in this tone and reconvene under calmer skies." "Calm," Angela said, "still soft, does not arrive on command. It arrives when the truth no longer has to argue for itself." The room heard it. Even the clock on the wall seemed to listen, though it had only one job, which was to move its hands at a rate no one could bargain with. In the corridor, a young officer paused as he passed and looked in, then continued because he could think of nothing to do with what he felt. Turner consulted a small pad he kept in the inner pocket, wrote a note with a capped pen, and replaced the pen with the kind of care that belongs to a habit. He turned back to the clerk. "We will need the signing ledger for the last 6 months," he said, "and the training schedule for traffic operations." 6 months, Hayes repeated. Not quite a question and not quite a protest. Angela did not tilt her head. "That is how long the pattern has been obvious to anyone who lives under it," she said. She did not say the words for emphasis. She said them because they were true. The custodian, who had retreated to give the floor to official shoes, reappeared with a stack of dry towels and began to blot the puddle forming near the entrance. He worked with quiet efficiency and, seeing Angela's damp coat, offered a towel without comment. She accepted, pressed it once to the collar, and returned it with thanks. Courtesy moved like a small current through the room, unwilling to concede the space entirely to power. Carter stood close enough that Angela could hear the next words before he said them at full volume. "Ma'am," he murmured, "I can witness your statement regarding the events at the curb if you wish to place it on the record now. Or we can wait until counsel arrives." "We will wait," Angela said. She kept her voice at the same register she had held all evening. It matters that we do this correctly. The cup of water on the counter had cooled to room temperature. She lifted it, sipped once, and set it down exactly where it had been. Outside, the rain thinned. The neon sign of the diner across the street buzzed back to a fuller brightness, red letters reflecting on wet pavement. Through the window, a server topped off a customer's coffee and folded a check under a sugar caddy. The man reached for his wallet and, without looking, set down a couple of bills for a tip. Across the city and across a lifetime, small gestures kept adding up, even when larger systems were subtracting. An aide leaned into Turner's shoulder and murmured, and Turner gave one brief nod. He faced the room and said in an even tone that carried without being loud, "From this moment forward, evidence preservation protocols are in effect. All relevant digital and physical materials will be secured under joint federal procedure. Access will be logged and monitored. Any pending actions that could alter records are suspended until further notice." Hey, Stevens opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Colonel, you are overstepping." Turner did not sound irritated. He sounded like a man reading the time. "I have direct authorization from the appropriate office," he said. "We will coordinate. We will not improvise." Angela felt the words settle into the room like furniture that had always belonged there. She allowed herself a small breath that might, in another context, have qualified as relief. Not the relief of winning, there was no winning in this story yet, but the relief of a door that had stood locked for a season now opened onto a lit hallway. Carter took a half step back and let his shoulders ease, just a fraction. He kept his hands visible. He watched the technician scroll through lines of text that spelled out what everyone here had long known and what some had convinced themselves could remain a private understanding forever. Hayes, sensing where the floor now tilted, shifted tactics again. "Colonel," he said, summoning earnestness and placing it between them like an offering, "you have my full cooperation. Lincoln Park values transparency. Transparency is easier," Turner said, "when glass is cleaned before it fogs." He looked to the clerk. "Please notify your supervisor that a formal notice is en route." The clerk nodded, and the motion seemed to begin before he had decided to make it. He reached for the mouse with the care of a man picking up a sleeping child and clicked open the station's email client to clear space on the screen. The cursor blinked in the white box, expectant. For a suspended second, even the building's old fluorescent tubes felt as if they might quiet themselves to hear better. Then the first chime sounded from the clerk's computer, a clean, bell-like note. A second machine in the records room answered, then a third down the hall, then another on the far desk where an officer had left a browser open to weather updates. The sound multiplied softly, a flock of notes settling, new messages stacked in a tidy column, each line bold until a mouse touched it. The subject lines matched, and their wording did not hedge. Preservation order issued for station systems and holdings. The messages carried a signature block that spelled out a name without abbreviation, and beneath it, in a line that needed no additional decoration, the location from which it had been signed, Washington, D.C. Emails pulsed across monitors in the temporary conference room, columns of subject lines blooming and then settling as if the building itself were blinking. Outside, the rain had ebbed to a wet hush against the windows, and the neon from the diner across the street smeared a soft red on the pane. No one argued about what the messages meant anymore. Angela's name sat in the preservation orders beside a title that needed no commentary. The room had the sound of a held breath let out in stages. She stood near the end of the table, letting the images move past without claiming her attention. She could still feel the quiet echo of the moment down the hall when the clerk had said the word Pentagon and the air had shifted by a degree. The tiny signal from her watch was long gone, but the path it lit had not faded. This was not triumph. She refused that word. It was alignment. The scale had tipped back toward level, even if only a notch. Carter returned from records with a fresh folder, damp at one corner where the ceiling had sweated. He set the folder on the table without theatrics. His eyes were tired in a clean way, the tiredness that comes when a person has done the right work for longer than is comfortable. "More scheduling notes," he said, voice low, "and deployment emails with identical phrasing. The geography repeats." He did not look at Stevens when he said repeats. He looked at Turner, then at the techs who were mapping the network on the portable console with calm hands. On the tray near the door, a cardboard pizza box steamed, the lid dark from the moisture. Someone had signed for the delivery a few minutes earlier, and an officer had peeled bills from his wallet and added a tip without being asked. The delivery driver had nodded, said a soft "appreciate you," and stepped back into the rain with his coat collar up. A small act, unremarkable, and exactly right. Angela noted it the way she noted everything else that made a room more human than efficient. Hayes paced at the edge of the conversation like a man looking for a camera angle that would forgive him. He straightened his jacket and tried the tone that had soothed donors in other rooms. "Colonel," he began, "we are all on the same team here. Everyone wants a safe city. The captain has kept Lincoln Park steady through a very busy season. I'm sure we can avoid turning an administrative question into a spectacle." Turner did not lift his voice. He didn't need to. "Councilman," he said, "the way to avoid spectacle is to follow the rules before the lights come on." He nodded to a tech. "Continue the capture. Mirror the mail server. Make read-only copies. Verify the checksums. And log every step." The tech replied with a simple "yes, sir," and kept typing. Keys clicked with the soft certainty of rain on a porch roof. The custodian slipped in with a fresh towel, dried the rubber mat by the door, and slipped out again, a quiet choreography at the edge of a louder dance. Stephen stood with his arms crossed, chin tilted to a height he had practiced. The posture, which had once worked on traffic stops and day shift briefings, no longer commanded the same obedience. O'Connor hovered just behind his shoulder, younger now in the better light, the clipboard tucked like a shield that had learned it could not block weather. "Colonel," Stephen said, temper leveled to a low simmer, "Lincoln Park has procedures. We're not a raw field site. You're cutting through authority that keeps order on the street." "We are honoring authority," Turner answered, "by preserving proof of what actually happened." He gestured to the clerk. "Bring us the sign-in logs for the last half year and the shift rosters for traffic operations." "Half a year?" Hayes repeated, wearing patience like a borrowed coat. "Surely we can focus on tonight's misunderstanding. There is no need to drag 6 months of routine enforcement into a spotlight." Angela let the sentence sit. When she spoke, her voice was warm and steady. "If a spotlight bothers the work, it's not the bulb's fault. People from the South Side have been telling a version of tonight for half a year, and before that, for longer than we should accept." Carter glanced at her with a grateful brevity that did not demand attention. He opened the folder and slid a few pages forward. "These are shift directives," he said to Turner. "They include phrases that recur. High yield corridor. Southbound filter near Fullerton. The same emphasis week after week." Stevens's jaw tightened. "You read cherry-picking language taken out of operational context." "Context," Carter said gently, "is what the map provides." He tapped a printed heat map that the tech had generated. Red clusters bloomed where the south side routes crossed into the north. If stops were evenly distributed by behavior, the pattern would look like a scattered sky. It doesn't. Hayes stepped in, palms open. "Colonel, again, we all value facts, but let's not turn correlation into accusation. The public expects decisive leadership, not meetings about maps." "The public," Turner said, "expects equal protection. Maps only embarrass a program when the program prefers shadows." The door opened, and a new aide in a dark blazer entered with a small printer under one arm and a spool of cable in the other. He placed the printer on the clear section of the table, connected it to the console, and within a minute it began to hum and produce hard copies. The first page slid out, the preservation order with a Washington, D.C. signature line that left little to debate. The second, a summary of user accounts with write access. The third, a simple list of times when body cameras had been triggered and times when they had not. The columns did not accuse, they described. Angela stepped closer, not to supervise, but to see. She did not touch the paper. She read names and dates and the quiet testimony of numbers that had been arranged by habit and now were arranged by attention. Beside her, a junior officer who had drifted in on an errand he no longer remembered read too, and then kept his hands at his sides like a student who did not want to knock over a lab beaker. "Captain," Turner said, Turning just enough to include Stevens without giving him the comfort of a full pivot, we will need your pre-shift briefing notes for the last quarter, printed or handwritten. The form does not matter. The content does. Stevens did not move. Colonel, you are questioning local management in the middle of a public safety operation. I am documenting a government operation in the precise way the public safety laws require, Turner replied. He did not step nearer. He didn't have to. And I am asking you to cooperate. Sigh, sigh. O'Connor's eyes went from Stevens to Hayes to the papers and back again, as if he were waiting for a card trick to resolve into something you could name without embarrassment. The clipboard drooped a degree in his hand. Carter selected a USB drive from his inner pocket, another copy, labeled with a small strip of tape and a careful hand, and set it near the console. Redundancy, he said, in case the first is compromised. He did not say who might compromise it. He did not need to. Hayes tried a new register, the confiding tone of a man who has smoothed disputes at city luncheons and school board fundraisers. Ma'am, he addressed Angela, I regret your discomfort. The last thing we want is for a respected member of our community to feel hassled. If you'd allow us to... Angela met his gaze with a quiet that made room for neither flattery nor scorn. Respect, she said, does not arrive after the fact like a bouquet. It arrives at the curb, or it arrives not at all. Being quiet. The sentence did not raise its voice, and yet it filled the room more effectively than any speech Hayes had given that month. Turner inclined his head by a fraction, the gesture of a man noting the moment an instrument tuned to the right pitch. The custodian reappeared with a small tray of paper cups and a pot of coffee from the diner, its handle wrapped in a towel to keep hands from burning. He set the tray near the printer and said, They'll send more if you need it, as if this were as important as any order. Carter thanked him and poured for the clerk first. The clerk dropped 2 sugar packets into his cup, stirred, and went back to the keyboard with a steadier hand. At the outer edge of the room, the television above the vending machine showed a news channel without sound. The crawl at the bottom mentioned committee calendars, a shipping backlog at the port, a local high school's championship game. The frame corner showed a live tag. Images of the Capitol appeared and vanished, a hint of where this would go when the printers had emptied themselves of ink and the city had caught its breath. From this point, Turner said, turning to face the span of the table, the federal team has custodial authority over the identified records. We will conduct interviews, beginning with line officers assigned to the recent checkpoints and progressing to supervisory staff. Nothing here is more urgent than getting this right. Stevens's voice lowered the octave a man uses when he would prefer not to be heard disagreeing. You're making a show of a small error. Colonel, the people we protect will not thank you for turning routine control into a bureaucratic parade. Sure be, the people you protect, Angela said, and she did not stress the you, deserve a routine that recognized them as people first. Hayes' smile thinned. He turned to Stevens with the posture of a man deciding which wall to lean his ladder against. Captain, let's provide what they're asking for. No one benefits from the impression that we resist transparency. The printer chattered out another page. Carter lifted it, scanned, and slid it toward Turner. Pre-shift briefing, mid-March, he said. A line reads, vehicles from the south side require full treatment. He kept his voice flat. That phrase appears again in early April, then again in late May. Stevens did not claim forgery. He did not claim context. He stared at a spot on the wall 2 inches above Turner's shoulder, the way a man might look at a hook where he used to hang a coat he no longer wears. Angela rested her hand on the back of a chair, feeling the cool metal through her sleeve. She did not savor the moment. Savoring belonged to the kinds of endings life rarely provided. She simply stood with the work, and the work stood with her. Down the corridor, someone laughed in the wrong room and realized it, and the sound faded into an apology. The pizza box on the tray was open now, and a couple of slices had been taken with napkins folded just so, as if to keep the grease off the logs. The delivery driver would be halfway to another order by now, counting the tip with a mental math that included rent and gas and a promise made to a child about new shoes in November. The door to the conference room clicked as an officer from another shift eased in, saw the lineup of faces and the stack of printed pages, and eased back out again with a nod that landed somewhere between respect and self-preservation. Turner capped his pen, slid it into an inner pocket, and looked down the table where Angela stood. "Thank you for your patience," he said, offering the courtesy without pity. "We will move to the next phase shortly." She nodded. She could feel the night turning its face toward morning, even though the clock insisted there were still hours to go. The printers would run, the maps would print, the interviews would begin. And after that, rooms larger than this one would need to listen. A live banner on the television brightened, the camera cutting to a correspondent in a heavy coat on the Washington sidewalk. Angela looked toward the window, where the glow of Capitol Hill filled the live broadcast on the television. She knew the fight was about to move to the national stage. A week can teach a city how to listen. By the time the sun rose on Washington, the trees along the mall wore their late autumn reds and golds like quiet flags, and the air tasted of cold stone and coffee. Angela stepped from the sedan at the foot of the Capitol's east steps, her dress uniform tailored to movement rather than spectacle. A press pen rustled to her right, tripods clicked taller, microphones wore network logos like boutonnieres. She acknowledged no camera, but she did not avoid them. She walked as a citizen first, an officer second, and a witness always. Inside, the corridors held that particular Capitol hush that is not silence so much as held purpose. Staffers with stacks of binders moved at a practiced pace that suggested both urgency and rehearsal. The hearing room itself offered rows of polished wood, small lamps that cast warm halos on notepads, and the background music of papers settling. At the dais, nameplates waited in a neat line, each one a small stage for an inquiry. A clock mounted high at the rear ticked its way toward the hour, impartial as weather. Colonel Michael Turner took a chair 2 rows behind Angela, his notebook closed on his knee, his posture the unobtrusive geometry of a man comfortable near power without the need to imitate it. Detective Anthony Carter stood at the side aisle with the marshal, holding a slim evidence case that had seen careful hands and 2 checklists. Councilman Richard Hayes arrived with an aide and a lawyer. The 3 of them tuned to different stations of the same strategy. He wore less green in his pocket today. He sat where cameras would find him easily and mistake nearness for relevance. The committee entered to a rustle of fabric and a hum of responsibility clearing its throat. The chair called the session to order, voice warm, but framed by rules older than anyone in the room. Angela raised her right hand, swore, and took her seat at the witness table. The glass water pitcher beside her threw latticework reflections onto the wood, a reminder that light and angles make patterns even when no one is trying. Her opening statement did not strain to be memorable. It aimed to be accurate. She described a set of facts. A temporary checkpoint along a tree-lined street in Lincoln Park. A lawful stop turning into something else. A request for clarity treated like an affront. A wall phone ringing in a station, and a clerk saying a word that made grown people reconsider their posture. She described a quiet signal sent not to secure a favor but to secure a record. She made a map in sentences and let the map speak. When she spoke of the South Side, she did not use romance or pity. She used the vocabulary of a neighbor. Grocery stores, bus stops, church suppers, night shifts, light left on in the window for the one who arrived tired. A senator with a pen balanced lightly between his fingers leaned forward. "General Robinson," he said, "to make sure we understand the foundation here, is your testimony that the checkpoint in question was part of a regular program rather than an ad hoc response?" "My testimony," Angela answered, "is that what I encountered that night mirrored what residents have reported for many months. A program can be dressed in many names. It recognizes itself when it looks in the mirror of data." She kept her voice at a pitch that would carry to the last row without becoming a performance. Turner's team had already provided the committee with packets. Carter stepped forward on the chair's invitation and slid the evidence case onto the table, opening it with the care of a person who understands that an object and a moment can be harmed by the same kind of hurry. He described the chain of custody in spare sentences. He handed up a drive, then another. A staffer connected one to a government laptop, a projector hummed, and a screen at the back of the room accepted the light. A heat map blossomed. No one needed a legend to see what bloomed red and where. Detective Carter, a senator asked, in your professional assessment, what does this concentration indicate? Carter did not point with his hand. He pointed with his words. It indicates that, regardless of stated policy, the operational reality placed a heavier burden on vehicles associated with a particular neighborhood. The pattern persists across different shifts and different days. That regularity argues against coincidence. Another staffer advanced the display. Pre-shift notes appeared. The font ordinary, the phrasing less so. A line repeated across weeks. Vehicles from the south side require full treatment. A second line, less blunt, but no less clear. High-yield corridor on the border, ensure thorough screening. The room did not gasp. This was not a theater. But the sound of pens committing to paper changed, and the microphones on the dais drifted closer to mouths. Councilman Hayes, the chair said after a pause that gave meaning a chance to seat itself, you've supported this program publicly. Would you care to comment on these internal directives? Hayes employed a voice he often used at business breakfasts. Madam Chair, first, let me say that community safety is our shared objective. Any phrasing that appears blunt on a memo should be understood in the context of high traffic stress points where we've seen issues. We serve a diverse city. We make hard choices to keep it moving. 到得多的三思而四. A senator with hair the color of snow and a gaze that has seen many such mornings asked, hard choices for whom, Councilman? Who carries the weight of those choices in their daily lives? And on what constitutional basis? Hayes shifted to cooperation. If phrasing was inelegant, I regret that. Our intent was fairness. Intent can't write citations, the senator replied gently. Intent doesn't stand beside a car on a wet evening. Angela did not watch Hayes. She watched the room make room for the ordinary courage of basic questions. She thought of the custodian who had steered his mop bucket around official shoes without a splash, and the server who had poured late coffee and tucked a check away with a tip that would be measured against bus fare. Justice does not always arrive in a robe. Often it arrives in a sentence finally spoken aloud. Another exhibit filled the screen, a simple table of camera activations and deactivations. No one narrated it. Each column did its own work. The committee council noted the gaps, the dates, the curious habit of silence in moments that had consequential outcome. Turner spoke once to confirm how the preservation orders had arrived and to state the authority under which his team acted. He did not over-explain. He checked the box on the form and sat back into stillness. During a short recess, staffers delivered coffee in paper cups and bowls of wrapped mints. Angela took neither. She stood for a moment near a window that held a sliver of gray sky and allowed herself to feel the good ache of a long day spent standing up straight. Carter joined her with a nod. He said, almost to the glass, my brother still keeps his hospital ID on his nightstand. Not because he forgets where to find it, but because he never wants to be the person at the curb without proof someone else respects. Lei? Angela considered the reflection of his face next to hers. Two people assembled from different streets, and the same set of promises. He shouldn't have to keep it there, she said. None of us should need to carry anything more than our rights to be recognized as full. When the committee returned, the room reassembled around its purpose. A senator with a measured cadence asked Angela the question she knew would arrive sooner or later. General Robinson, you are a 4-star officer. On that evening in Chicago, you did not identify yourself as such at the curb. Why? Angela placed both hands flat on the table. The wood felt cool and honest. Because most of the people from the South Side cannot save themselves from humiliation by announcing a title. Because the Constitution belongs to them without a preface. Because I wanted the record to reflect what happens when a citizen complies, speaks with respect, and asks for clarity, and is met by something else. She did not raise her voice. The conviction did not work for her. I did not conceal my identity to create an ambush. I allowed the system to reveal itself under ordinary light. The sentence did not explode. It landed. A page turned at the dais. The chair lowered her eyes to a note and then lifted them again. Thank you, she said. Not as thanks for a performance, but as thanks for exactness. Hayes asked for opportunity to add context. He spoke of donors who feared crime, of constituents who wrote about property values, of a thin blue line he had invoked in speeches because it fit on a bumper sticker A senator let him finish and then said with a softness that did not spare him anything, "Values are sustained by law, councilman, not by lines drawn without authority." Alfund. Turner provided a final technical summary, copies made under checksum, devices logged and sealed, interviews scheduled with line officers in a way that honored union rights and due process. He did not speak to motives, he spoke to facts. Carter answered 2 more questions about internal complaint pathways and how often such complaints were marked resolved without investigation. He did not sound aggrieved. He sounded like a person practiced at placing stones in a straight line until they made a path. A staffer brought forward a draft title for Act words about equitable enforcement and transparency. The room did not legislate on the spot. It recognized a direction. Angela listened without presumption. In her mind, she drew small arrows from sentences toward streets, where sentences had been required for far too long and seldom supplied. The chair offered Angela a last open invitation. "If you have a closing thought for the committee, General, you may offer it now." She looked along the rows of people elected, assigned, hired, summoned, and thought of a town hall flyer on a passenger seat and a plastic clear-top tip jar, and the steady hands of a clerk who had said a heavy word without drama. "Calm," she said, repeating the truth that has served her in rooms without windows does not arrive on command. It arrives when the truth no longer has to argue for itself. She let the sentence be the measure. She did not reach for more. Outside the room, the corridor filled with the low weather of reporters assembling themselves into sentences that would travel farther than they could walk. Turner closed his notebook. Carter secured the evidence cases, latches, checked them, then checked them again, a habit rather than a fear. Hayes conferred with his counsel while staring at nothing in particular, as if empty air might confess. Angela stepped once more to the window before leaving. The sky had brightened by a degree, thin sun testing the edge of a cloud. Buses leaned at their stops, released passengers into their days, and pulled away with sighs that sounded like patience. A school group in matching sweatshirts filed past the rotunda on silent soles, led by a teacher who counted without moving her lips. Somewhere, in a Southside church basement, someone was probably labeling trays for a community supper with a roll of blue tape and a permanent marker. In the press scrum outside, microphones craned forward, ready to name the day for people who had lived versions of it already. Angela would speak briefly and then leave, not to escape questions, but to avoid becoming the only subject. She held her cover in her hand, the brim lightly resting against her leg, her other hand open. The chair's gavel fell and the room released its breath in that civilized way. That means both nothing and everything. Members rose, spoke to one another in small circles, promised follow-ups. Staffers collected documents into new stacks. A marshal opened the door with his shoulder and held it there for a line of people who understood courtesy before they understood rules. Cameras panned to the Capitol lawn, where crowds from Chicago and many other states hold signs. Justice for Southside. All Fei Fei. Late light lay across the south side like a hand kept open in welcome. The lot where the checkpoint once stood was nothing now but an expanse of damp gravel and a fringe of grass pushing back up through the tired soil. The city had removed the cones and the portable signs, the floodlights and the tape, and left behind a square of quiet sky no longer split by strobes. Traffic moved as traffic should, with turn signals like patient wings and brakes like a string of small red beads stretching toward the evening. A city bus sighed at a stop and let off a handful of riders who tucked coats closer and headed toward porches where pumpkins waited on stoops and light spilled from kitchen windows. The air held that late autumn mix of cinnamon from a bakery, gasoline from a corner station, and wet leaves. It smelled like a season remembering how to be gentle. Inside the brick church on the next block, folding chairs had been set in rows, and a long table along the wall offered casseroles under foil tents, bowls of greens, and a tray of sweet potato pie cut into careful squares. A volunteer in a cardigan had taped hand-lettered signs to the front of each dish, and there was a roll of blue painter's tape for late arrivals to add their names. A coffee urn the size of a suitcase rattled as it kept the brew warm, and a stack of paper cups stood ready next to a shaker of nutmeg. Near the entry, a basket for donations sat beside a plate of mince, and the small sign read, Thank you for helping keep the lights on. People filtered in with the rhythm of a neighborhood, used to finding one another at predictable places and hours. A caregiver in scrubs who had come straight from a shift, a barber who set his apron on the back of a chair, a teacher with a stack of graded papers in a tote, a teenager with a basketball under his arm, and a handshake ready for every elder who remembered his granddad. Angela arrived without ceremony. The brim of her coat beaded with rain. She paused to brush a fingertip along the entry table as if to greet the wood itself. She was not in uniform. She would not make the evening about the clothes on her back. She stepped to the side to let an older couple through the doorway, and then moved with them into the flow of voices and laughter that sounded like a recipe a grandmother never needed to measure. People turned when they noticed her and did not swarm. They made space the way a crowd makes space for someone carrying a candle by a shared intuition about light and wind. The pastor offered a brief welcome and then ceded the microphone to the people sitting in the folding chairs. There was no dais, just a small rise near the pulpit and a microphone on an old stand that leaned forward like a listening ear. The first to speak was a grandfather who told a story about an evening summer when a checkpoint sent him 3 blocks out of his way and made him late for the end of a concert his granddaughter played in. He said he still caught the last note through the church door and felt like an apology from the sky. And everybody laughed in that way. Communities learned to laugh so they will not make their throats into stone. A young mother spoke next. She described a gas station stop turned longer than it should have been, and how a neighbor had waited with her toddler until she could come back with a gallon can. The neighbor stood nearby and waved a hand as if to erase the applause. To him, it had been nothing. To the woman, it had been a lifeline. Detective Anthony Carter slipped in beside the back row, the brim of his fedora damp from drizzle, the band ink dark. He did not care for hats, but his mother had insisted a man should approach a church with his hat covered in the rain and then lifted the hat by the crown in the doorway. He placed it on a hook by the fire extinguisher and took a seat near the aisle. A few people recognized him and nodded without announcing his name, as if not to disturb the edges of a new beginning. He had started his first week at the bureau in a civil rights unit that was understaffed and unglamorous, and he liked it that way. He had carried forms and interviews across the city like someone ferrying water to a brush fire and watched small flames relent. The floor came to a grandmother in a navy dress, with a cardigan the color of coal, a scarf tied with tidy ends under her chin. She held the microphone with 2 hands, as if it might otherwise float away. Her voice was soft, but the room leaned toward it instinctively. "I am not long for microphones," she said, and smiled at the laughter that rose in reply. "I will say a short thing. My grandson wants me to speak, and when I was his age and my mother asked me to speak, I did not. So I am mending that." She turned, found Angela with a gaze that made one point in the room more exact than any other point. "General," she said, "the title spoken not as worship but as respect. You did not make this evening happen by yourself. I know that. We have been telling and bring dishes and telling again. But you brought a light. My grandson can go to class now and not carry a fear like a lunch pail. He got his scholarship back. He says thank you. I say thank you." Applause welled without breaking anything in the room. The pastor lifted a hand, not to stop the sound, but to keep it from turning into noise. When it softened, Angela stood and walked a slow, direct path to the microphone. She did not rush. She let the time keep itself honest. Her hands were empty. She placed them on the wooden stand, steady, as if to hold the wood still. She looked across the rows and saw faces she knew and faces she would come to know. She saw the custodian from the station, cold shoulders still carrying a faint white dust from a day spent under ceiling tiles. She saw the clerk who had answered the phone and said a heavy word without fuss. She saw a trio of teenagers with church ushers, pockets square and straight in their coats, and a woman with a wicker tray of communion cups she had washed and dried for years. Angela took one breath, then spoke in that radio-warm register that could read a grocery list and still make it sound like care. "You gave me the story," she said. "I did not bring the story to you. I brought a mirror and I held it steady, and the story showed its face." She tilted her hat once toward the grandmother. "And ma'am, your grandson brought his courage in a backpack he did not let anyone take from him. Courage has weight. and he carried it. There were questions. People asked about the next step and the step after that. Angela did not promise what no one could promise. She described a process like a path someone had enough stones to mark now, how a review board would begin to come cases, how a hotline had been funded, how a neighborhood legal clinic would host Saturday hours with volunteers who knew that a right is only as real as a door propped open for the person who needs it after work. She said that the Equitable Enforcement Act would take longer than anyone wished because laws and kitchens share this truth. If you rush them, they break. Parents ask about traffic stops and what to teach teenagers. She said, teach them the law and teach them kindness and teach them to survive. She said, teach them to call you and call a neighbor and call a world that is learning to act like it remembers how to be a neighborhood. Carter rose when a pause allowed and stepped to the side of the stage. He did not climb onto it. He spoke from the floor so the stage would belong to the people who had earned it. I took a new job, he said, and I will be spending my days helping make sure what happened does not happen again. Not here and not in any other city. Some of you know about my brother. He's a doctor. He keeps his hospital badge at the corner of his nightstand, and he has not moved it since the night a checkpoint sent him home newer to fear than a man should be at his age. His record is clear now. He sent me a text with a photo of that badge in the drawer. I know it sounds like a small thing. It isn't. He let the words rest. I am here as your neighbor tonight. If you see me at the diner, please say hello. I tip in cash. And I listen. Laughter washed up to the windows and returned as light. The server from that very diner, still in her apron, lifted a hand from the back row and said she would hold him to it. The woman beside her elbowed her and whispered that she would hold him to it, too, and everyone around them nodded. A man at the end of an aisle said he had a nephew who should sit with someone from the bureau to hear how to fill out a complaint form without getting lost in the shrinking boxes. Carter said to send the nephew Saturday morning, and the pastor made a note on a legal pad he had borrowed from the usher table. The room quieted again, not from fatigue, but from that sweet sobriety that fills a small place when people agree not to rush the last important thing. Angela lifted the microphone a notch and set it back down. She did not rehearse the sentence. It had been walking with her for days, and all she needed to do now was stop long enough for it to catch up. It is not rank, but justice and truth that bring freedom. The words did not ring like a line meant for a poster. They fell like a hand placed on a shoulder, firm, warm, and enough. Silence held a heartbeat longer than silence needs to become comfort. And then the room answered with a kind of applause that begins in the stomach, not the hand. The grandmother in the cardigan nodded and pressed her lips together the way people do when they decide to cry later. Not now, because they intend to carry leftovers to neighbors after the meeting. The pastor stepped to the side, folded the microphone cord into a lazy loop, and offered a short prayer whose lines were as simple as bread. People said amen as if to confirm a plan that would require each of them, not only the woman at the microphone, to keep showing up. Chairs began to scrape back in polite unison. Someone called for plates. Teenagers carried trays of cups. The coffee urn rattled as it refilled itself like a faithful machine in a kitchen that has seen too many winters to mind one more. People lined up and served one another portions too generous for a weeknight. The server from the diner refused to sit and instead moved along the row with napkins and extra forks. A police officer out of uniform accepted a slice of pie from a woman who had once come to the station looking for her nephew. They nodded at each other as if to say, let us do this right. In the corner, near the potted plant that had seen better summers, a young man in a hoodie practiced thank you over and over until he walked up to Angela and let it out just once, and she said, you are welcome, in the tone that made room for his next breath. After plates were cleared and stories had taken one more turn around the room, Angela stepped out onto the church steps. The concrete was damp and held the day's footprints like faint stamps. Across the street, two boys played a half-court game with a ball soft from use, their shots arcing against the sky, learning to let go of its last light. A city bus passed, and the driver lifted two fingers from the wheel in a quiet greeting that means, I see you and we share this block. The smell of wood smoke from a nearby backyard mingled with the steam from the storm drain. Somewhere, a radio played a slow song from a decade nobody meant to forget, and the notes found an alley and walked down it. Carter joined her with his hat back in his hands. They will ask you to make speeches, he said. They will ask you to sit at too many desks, she said. He smiled without showing teeth. They already did. They will tell you to hurry, she said. I will try not to, he answered. I know what breaks when we rush. Down the stairs, the grandmother in the navy dress took a seat on the low brick wall, her knees grateful for the rest. Her grandson, taller than she was by a head and a half, draped an arm across her shoulders in a gesture both protective and tender. A neighbor teased him about thinking he was grown. He laughed and said, "Not yet." And the older man on the steps approved of his answer without saying so. Angela looked past them to the lot where the checkpoint had stood and then looked away so the night would not think it had won by being noticed too long. She allowed herself one memory of the curb, the laminate counter, the way a clerk had placed the phone back in its cradle with respect. The memory did not twist. It settled. She let it take its chair at the long table in her mind, with the others that had fed her courage when she had needed second helpings. She did not feed it more than it deserved. She walked with Carter toward the corner where the diner set its neon back to glowing after supper. Inside, a couple split a slice of pie and argued quietly about a high school game neither of them had seen but both remembered as legend. The server lifted the coffee pot and made rounds with the rhythm of someone who knows how to keep a room at the right temperature. Angela left the tip in cash under the edge of her saucer, the bills folded neat and square, and thanked the server by name. The server said, "See you Sunday," because that is what people in the neighborhood say when they intend to be part of a week together. They walked back out under a sky brushed thin with cloud, children's voices braided with the sound of a train line whispering along tracks beyond the houses. Angela stood with one hand on the rail, the other tucked into her coat pocket where her watch rested against her skin. Quiet now, a tool put away with care. She thought of the schedule waiting for her in the morning, and the calls, and the way laws become real by being practiced, like hymns that only live if someone sings them. She lifted her face to the wind and felt it carry damp and leaf and the far edge of winter. The camera lifted to the Chicago sky, leaves swirling in the wind. The image closes, but the echo remains. The evening closed with no fanfare, only the quiet comfort of neighbors gathering over shared meals and the simple relief of knowing a shadow had been lifted. What began at a single curb had unfolded into a truth strong enough to be spoken aloud, and the strength of ordinary people has shown itself brighter than any uniform or title. In that light rests the lesson. Prejudice may wound, power may stray, but compassion and persistence can stitch a community back together. Just as a porch lamp left on through the night guides someone home, a single act of steady kindness can guide us all through the hardest stretches of life. Take a moment to notice the quiet gifts around you, the handshake, the shared pie, the nod of respect, and if this story touched your heart, consider passing a little warmth forward to those still waiting for their turn in the light.